So let's look at Iago's plot. So one of the questions is, why does he do this? And we could say there's two reasons. One, he's out to get them, right? He's got some grudge. He has some hatred of Othello, hatred of Cassio, for Cassio taking a spot that he thought was his in the military. But there's another reason, and that's simply that Iago has the cunning and skills to pull off this plot. And it's part of his intellectual powers. And it seems to be the case that part of his motivation is simply to do that which he is good at. And one of the perverse ironies of human nature is that some people are good at finding cures for awful drugs, and some people are good at being bad. Iago deceives others because he's adept and adept at understanding the psychology of others and the springs that motivate them. Iago is a psychologist. He is the most rational character of the play, and he understands what makes people tick, and therefore, he knows how to exploit them. And by knowing how to exploit them, he is then able to use them as instruments in his plot. The way he sets up the various characters are all parts of the puzzle in succeeding with this plot. And it's this ability to manipulate the characters. He knows them, in a sense, better than they know themselves. And that ability is what drives the plot forward. We get a pretty clear sense of what the other characters' motivation are. Honor, love, respect, power, the way they appear. But what Iago is motivated by is unclear. One of the interesting things about his plot, and diabolically, is that it succeeds. And not only does it succeed, it seems to have succeeded perfectly. Now, yes, Iago gets caught at the end of the play. But what else could he have expected from this plot? Once it is completely unfolded, so that's one element. Number two, in his early speeches in Act 1, it's very clear that he talks about the way in which the plot and what is in his mind that he's cooked up will come to light. Will come to light. And there's no way for this plot to come to light unless everybody knows that he was the perpetrator of it and he was the mastermind. And there's a sense in which his own sense of superiority and excellence, his virtues of mind, we might say, he wants them to be known by the world. He wants to show the world what he is capable of. He wasn't able to be the general. He is not wealthy, but he's intelligent. So he employs his wits in the domain that he has available to him. Iago works on four characters: Roderigo, Cassio, Desdemona, and Othello. And his plot with each of them really becomes a thread in the larger plot, which is the downfall of Othello. And it's kind of like dominoes. He sets the first three dominoes in a row, and they all culminate in crashing in on Othello. He's able to do this precisely because he has a psychological understanding of these characters. He knows what motivates them, and therefore he can pull the right string or push the right button, depending on the metaphor that he needs to. So Iago exploits Roderigo's wealth and his rabid passion for Desdemona. Roderigo's obsessed with Desdemona, and he thinks he can buy her love through paying Iago. So what does Iago do? Give me your money, and I'll give you the girl. Right? Playing on his hopes, his desires, but also his belief that money can buy him what he wants. He exploits Cassio. Cassio values honor and friendship, and the respect, particularly the respect he gets from Othello. Iago manages, through contriving a smaller plot within the plot, to get Cassio relieved falsely. Really fascinating here. If you want to understand how diabolical Iago is, once he has contrived this little downfall for Cassio, he then comes to his aid as his friend, as good friend Iago, as honest Iago, to solve the problem that he has created. Now that is an interesting thing to do. And so what does he tell Cassio to do? Go to Desdemona and plead your case with Desdemona, because you have her ear if you don't have Othello's, and if you have her ear, that means you will have Othello's, because she has Othello's ear. Othello will listen to her. Iago then deceives Desdemona to be her honest and good friend. Meanwhile, he's tasked his wife, Desdemona's maid, Amelia, to steal the handkerchief, which becomes the proof of Desdemona's infidelity when it's found in the possession of Cassio. And so with Desdemona, on one hand, he's working his rhetoric with Othello, making Othello increasingly suspicious about his wife, but then he goes to Desdemona and is supportive with her and acts as if he is a true friend working on her behalf. So Iago exploits Othello's innocent and passionate nature, his concern for honor in a society that's subtly prejudiced against him. So he's also exploiting Othello's insecurities. Let's step through this for a second. Othello's innocence and his passionate nature is presented as a stereotype of a Moor, right? This kind of derogative stereotype, and there are other reasons for the motivation. He's also a soldier. He's a man who has seen a lot in life, but he's seen a lot of a certain type of thing in life, and that is on the battlefield, where men experience things that ordinary people don't get to see. They have to show virtues and maybe have vices that ordinary people don't have and don't see, right? But when he's off the battlefield, when he's dealing with the subtleties of etiquette of society, he is not subtle. He doesn't, Iago is the subtle serpent. And Venetian society is urbane and subtle and slightly sneaky and deceptive. It's rife with hypocrisy and duplicity. The thing is, the duplicity and hypocrisy of Venetian society is what's understood as acceptable by everyone. And we're not talking about major transgressions. We're talking about transgressions of a more ordinary fashion, whereas Othello, like his wife, are very pure and very innocent. What they say is what they do. And one of their problems is they themselves are not duplicitous, and therefore they cannot see, which means what they present here is what they have inside. And the problem is Venetian society is duplicitous, and precisely because they are straightforward and not duplicitous, they cannot see the duplicity before them, which is partly why Iago's plot succeeds so well. Iago also exploits Othello's deep, passionate, and obsessive love for his wife. Othello is not a naturally jealous man, but the intensity of his love for his wife is leveraged against him as he is made to suspect her. So you can see that the very love that he has for his wife, if he can be tipped to believing that she has been unfaithful, that love, that energy, that kind of passionate energy he has, is then transformed and translated into jealousy, almost its opposite. So the intensity of his emotions are channeled by Iago into his suspicions and his jealousy, right? And if you notice something about Iago in his very rational nature, is that he is very rarely passionate. He provokes other people to be passionate and simply watches them suffer and fall for their excesses. He is able, unlike the other characters, to curb his desires. So Iago exploits Othello's native trust and sense of comradeship in this time of trouble with his wife. A friend in need is a friend indeed, right? Othello believes he's found a real port in the storm in his friendship with Iago. So again, Iago creates the problem and then in this instance presents himself as a solution, as Othello's sounding board. And of course all the advice he gives him, rather than helping him, only leads to the demise and the fall of the whole situation. Of course, Othello could not be more wrong. Iago has been building a mental cave of appearances around Othello, not only through manipulating Othello, but the actions of all the other main characters as well. So this is a really important point, that in creating this world of deception of Iago's making is quite comprehensive, and we can therefore understand how, despite Othello's innocent and passionate nature, that we can understand perfectly why even a reasonable person would be duped by the machinations, by Iago's machinations. So, throughout the early stages, first 2 acts, 3 acts of the play, Iago constantly insinuates these claims and rumors that he's heard about Desdemona, and Othello says, "You must bring me proof. If you are going to make accusations against my wife, you better be telling the truth. You better be right, or you're going to be the one who's in trouble." And he says, "Show me the proof. Show me," what he calls the ocular proof. What is ocular? Oculus is an eye. The ocular proof is evidence seen with the eyes. And of course the problem with this proof is that it is ocular, but it is no proof of all. The discovery of the handkerchief with Cassio means something other than what Othello is made to believe it means. So it's a misinterpretation based on the deceptions that have been set up by Iago, The handkerchief is not simply evidence of transgression, but and this is important, this is partly why it becomes the anchor and the last straw. It was a symbol of the love between Desdemona and Othello. It's the first gift he gives her in their relationship, and it's a keepsake from his mother, so it has this, it's a memento, there's a certain special value to it. And the giving of the handkerchief is clearly not just the giving of an object. It symbolizes his giving of his love, his giving of his fidelity, his giving of his faith and belief in her. And of course, she apparently gives all that away. So it's a symbol of a bond with his wife, and once she has it, it's a symbol of her fidelity to him. And it's this handkerchief that he tells the story of his mother having it, and then her, as she died, she was dying, giving it to him, and has these strawberries on it, and the handkerchief seems very much to be a symbol of Desdemona's fidelity, her sexual fidelity, and having given it to another man is something like having evidence, quote unquote, of having given her body to another man. Okay, so now the plot overview in terms of the breakdown of each act. The play is a 5-act play, so let's go through the acts. In Act 1, we have Rodrigo, a very kooky and comic character, who's a wealthy and dissolute gentleman who complains to his friend Iago. We don't know how they became friends. They're clearly not very good friends, but they clearly have a certain familiarity with each other. He complains that Iago has not told him about the secret marriage between Desdemona and Othello. Now, why is that important? Iago has been leading him on for a long time that he's going to get him access to Desdemona, and by not telling them this, it feels like he's been deceived, and he has been just that, led on. Iago claims to hate Othello, and I think claims is important here, for having promoted the younger Cassio. And it's not just that he's younger, he's less experienced. He doesn't have, at least as Iago tells us, this is the appearance, this is what he says. We don't know We don't get the definitive truth about this. We do know that Cassio turns out to be a good man, but that's not to say he isn't without his vices. And he claims that he got promoted despite the fact that he really has very little experience, and that perhaps he even purchased his position. But none of that is borne out in the play. We don't know that to be a fact. And the fact that Cassio is loyal and loves Othello, it actually seems like Othello picked him for the proper reasons, because he would be a good right-hand man and a good soldier. Iago convinces Rodrigo to wake Brabantio and tell him that of his daughter's elopement. Meanwhile, Iago sneaks away to find Othello and warns him that Brabantio is coming for him. So immediately you can see how Iago pulls the strings of all these characters, setting certain actions in motion that are all going to, like gears that are all going to start to mesh together and move this plot forward. Once Brabantio learns of this, he immediately heads to confront Othello. Othello is about to be taken by the Doge's guards to the Palazzo Ducale, the Doge's palace, to be briefed on this attack that the Turks have made against Cyprus, and he's commissioning Othello, the general, to lead a military expedition to the island to prevent the Turks from being able to get any closer to Venice. And all of this situation, this contextual situation, prevents Brabantio from having the confrontation that he wants, which is helpful because then this confrontation unfolds in front of the Duke, the Doge of Venice, where he says some very wise words to both figures and puts Brabantio in his place. So with Iago having explained his plot, having set it in motion, having explained his motive for why he's committed to this plot, we now see Othello marrying his wife. We see the Doge commissioning Othello to go off to Cyprus. And in plot 2, we have the party arriving in Cyprus. They find that a storm has destroyed the Turkish fleet. So guess what? No war is to be fought. Right? But they're still on this citadel of Cyprus, this kind of military fortification. And two important points. The war that will play out has nothing to do with battleships and Muslim Turks and Christian Europeans. It has to do with a war between Iago and Othello. And of course, you know anything about fighting wars, that deception is one of the major components of winning wars, because you don't always have might. Sometimes might needs to come in the form of sneakiness and cunning, because Iago is certainly in a war for whatever reason with Othello, but Othello has no clue that there is a war, you could say a military operation, this strategy unfolding, and why would he think there is? Another important aspect about this context is that we're removed from the Venetian context. The Venetians, I've said it many times now, presented as very urbane and perceptive about the nature of relationships, boy-girl relationships, the dynamics, and having a kind of restraint, a kind of wise and light touch with them. In the Cyprus setting, it seems to be the very circumstances that allow Iago's plot to really germinate. The seeds can grow of the plot on Cyprus, but it's not clear that if they had stayed in Venice that he would have been able to perpetrate it. So in Act 2, Cassio gets drunk at this celebration they have of the fact that they're not fighting war, and he gets in a fight with Montano, who is the regent of the island. And of course, Othello is obliged to strip him of his rank, because he's done something that if the military is about discipline and order and following the authority of the authority figure, then what Cassio has done is violated all the basic principles of the military. So then, in the aftermath of that, Cassio then seeks out Desdemona to reinstate his status. And of course, that has all been promoted by Iago. So only once that stage has been set, with Cassio having been demoted and then sending him to Desdemona to get Othello's ear, only then, in Act 3, does Iago start unfolding the machinations regarding trying to make Othello suspicious about his wife and Cassio. And of course, now that Cassio is seeking out Desdemona, Othello is now going to see them interacting in clandestine way, because they're speaking about an issue that they don't want to be made public. And of course, it's not their affair, it's rather getting him reinstated. So Desdemona drops her handkerchief, and Emilia finds it and picks it up. And once that has happened, Iago, you might say, goes for the kind of kill shot with Othello in trying to convince him, Act 3, Scene 3. He sows the sufficient seeds of doubt that get Othello to do Iago's work for him. And we will look at that in a moment. In Act 4, Iago plants the handkerchief in Cassio's lodgings, and then tells Othello to watch Cassio's reaction while Iago questions him. Iago goads Cassio to talk about his affair with Bianca, and he talks about it in glowing terms. It just turns out that Othello thinks he's talking about his wife, Desdemona. This is, if Othello's mind has already been turned up to this point, seeing this scene with Cassio, apparently talking about Desdemona, enrages him, and he immediately resolves to deal with both Cassio and his wife. And he and Iago now become co-conspirators to kill both of them. So in Act 5 is when we start to see the conflict finally unfold, and all the dominoes that Iago has set up are now going to be knocked down. And he sets up a conflict between Cassio and Rodrigo, because he's now told Rodrigo that Cassio is with Desdemona. And of course, Iago has never delivered for Rodrigo, but he finds a way to convince him to keep trusting him. And of course, this puts Rodrigo and Cassio in direct conflict. And so notice, instead of Iago having to kill anyone, he gets the two pawns to attack each other, and Rodrigo ends up dying, and Cassio comes very close to dying. And in fact, Iago makes sure that Rodrigo dies so that he can never reveal the plot that's been unfolded. And then toward the end of Act 5, Othello finally confronts Desdemona and eventually kills her. And then Montano arrives with the delegation from Venice, and they actually turn out to be cousins of Desdemona. And they're shocked. And then the whole plot, everyone finally becomes aware in the last few speeches of what's happened. So I want to look at now the characterization of Othello, and I want to start from a kind of a fun place of just looking at some historical images of the way Othello has been portrayed. And what's interesting is, the text is dialogue. There is virtually no description, no stage direction, no characterization of how they dress or how they carry themselves exactly. And there's clearly some profound ambiguity in how we're to understand the extent to which Othello has been Europeanized and the extent to which he holds on to his ancestral culture and his ancestral religion. So in this image, we actually have him presented in a kind of North African, Middle Eastern style garb. that brings out his native roots. And in other versions, for example, he's dressed in much more European garb. I mean, this outfit being somewhat more ambiguous, but something looking kind of like a Roman general here. So this speech here in Act 5, Scene 2 really gets to the heart of the profound ambiguities and duplicity, the dual identities embedded within Othello's character. They're manifest in race, but I think ultimately they're cultural, they're religious, they have to do with customs and habits more than they have to do with the color of people's skin. But clearly skin color here is used to evoke these two cultural spheres that are presented as not harmonious with one another, particularly in that the Venetians were at war with the Muslim Turks. And in this passage, this is Othello's final speech right before he kills himself, and he talks about how he wants to be known by posterity. And he wants to, if posterity is going to acknowledge his vices and his flaws, they also should see his virtues. And what is fascinating and also rather disturbing is he talks about how he kills a Muslim Turk that he had killed in battle. And it is at this very moment that he kills himself, and this Turk that he kills becomes parallel to him in his dual identity. And how you react to this speech and how you react to Othello, or rather how you react to the speech, is going to have a lot to do with how you think about Othello in general. But I think the primary emotion provoked in the viewer from this speech, he demands your pity and your compassion, your understanding, your sympathy. And whether you give that depends on how you understand his degree of culpability for having killed or murdered his wife. He says, "Soft you, a word or two before you go. I have done the state some service, and they know it. Not more of that, I pray you. In your letters, when you shall these unlucky deeds relate, speak of me as I am, nothing extenuate." So it's when you speak about me, when you tell my story, and of course, the end of the play is in a sense the beginning of the play. So what's going to happen? The diplomats who are there, the cousins of Desdemona, they're going to go back to Venice, and they're going to tell the story of Othello. And what does he demand? Don't lie about me. Tell, at one point in the text, tell an unvarnished tale. Show me as I truly am. And this is not just a concern for Othello, but this is Shakespeare's concern. He wants to show human beings in their unvarnished state. And I dare say in a kind of amoral way. To say this, human beings are not perfect. This is what we are. To some extent, up to a point, we must embrace our imperfections. We must acknowledge the flaws of humanity and not simply condemn them morally and demonstrate that they're wrong, but rather simply appreciate what human... So I think that the challenge here is that if you only see people rigidly from a moral or moralistic perspective, it prevents you from seeing them at all, because you take the one flaw and you paint it as the whole picture of them. But if you can manage to say, yes, they're frail, yes, they're fallible, we accept that. Let's look at the whole person, though. And we do this, of course, all the time in our lives, and we're forced to do it. Why? Because, well, people aren't perfect. Okay. Nor set down aught in malice. So nothing extenuate, like extenuating circumstances. Don't try to paint me better than I am, and also don't paint me in malice. Don't make me worse than I am. Then must you speak. What is he saying? Tell the truth. Then must you speak of one that loved, not wisely, but too well, of one not easily jealous, but being wrought, perplexed in the extreme. So a man, let's just take him at face value. In a sense, Othello's not speaking here, but the play is speaking. The playwright is speaking about this character. He was made jealous, but that's but he was not easily made jealous in life, but that's precisely because his mind was wrought. It was twisted like wrought iron, and perplexed, confused, beguiled, right? What Iago does to him is what the serpent does to Eve. Perplexed in the extreme, of one whose hand, like the base Indian, threw a pearl away, richer than all his tribe. So this is interesting. The pearl that Othello has thrown away is his wife, Desdemona. And she's a pearl because she's precious. She's a pearl because she's pure. She's a pearl because she's white. She's fair. And the base Indian, he's dark-skinned. And that contrast there, and he's of a tribe. So this is he's obviously making an analogy to himself. This pearl was richer than all his tribe, of one whose subdued eyes, albeit unused to the melting mood, drops tears as fast as the Arabian trees, their medicinal gum. Set you down this, and say beside that in Aleppo once, where a malignant and turbaned Turk beat a Venetian and traduced the state, I took by the throat the circumcised dog and smote him thus. And so what's the image? He's a parallel to the story he's telling. Smote, to kill, to hit. He kills himself. And this character is acknowledging the doubleness of his own nature, that he has one foot in both worlds. He talks. This is his story here. This isn't this is an analogy, but it's based on something that he claims to have actually done. He killed a Muslim Turk in Aleppo, Syria, right? Fighting in this war of the Venetians against the Turks, because he's fighting on the side of the Europeans. But he also seems to clearly acknowledge that the person he was killing bore some resemblance to him, and it's not just a racial resemblance; it's a cultural resemblance. And he kills himself. This may be the most disturbing moment in the play, right? Because he's I'll leave it at that. So I just want to kind of review. We've talked, coming out of the ancient Greek world, their understanding of the human soul, which is to say human psychology, which is to say it's broken down into two fundamentally, potentially opposed parts, which are reason and passion, and that the soul is divided between reason and passion, and that what reason and passion are not geographical locations in your brain or your heart, but they're two different types of motivational sources that motivate your actions. And the Greeks, and Shakespeare certainly following them, sees human existence as a struggle between the passions and reason. And of course, this is a struggle over your soul, and this is a struggle that manifests itself in the course of your life, your way of life, your actions. And Othello is a shrewd warrior, but when he's off the battlefield, he doesn't seem to have the wherewithal to cope with the kind of nuanced psychological terrain of society. He is a passionate man, And if you think about that on the battlefield, that makes sense, that a certain kind of high emotional tenor is necessary to be a warrior, to have. And what is the prime virtue of a warrior? It's courage, which is connected with the passion of spiritedness, which is manliness, or something close even to anger. And Othello is typically presented as a very passionate character. And in a sense, he's innocent, but even as his passions are mostly innocent, they're also shown to be volatile because they're so intense. And that seems to be wherein lies the problem. If we compare, for example, Iago, he is cool as a cucumber. He is cunning and subtle and beguiling like the snake. He is elusive. Nobody even knows that he is the cause of this downfall until the very end. So we've got the soul, we've got reason, and then the two forms of passion that come in the form of spirit and appetite. And appetite is the desire for bodily well-being. We saw that with the suitors. Thumos is spiritedness. It's the thing that makes you get angry. And what causes anger? When other people or the world do not recognize your will, your agency, your desire for something to be done. And therefore, spiritedness is connected with your desire to be honored and recognized by the world, by others, by posterity, so on and so forth. Reason gives you the desire to understand and to control your passions, and to think calmly and deliberatively, right? And we see just very clearly that Iago has this capacity to reflect and deliberate in a very cold and calculating, Machiavellian way. We'll come back to that theme. And obviously Othello is a decent and righteous man, but he is more a creature of his passions. Up to a point, because obviously Iago's motive is built on passion. In fact, it's not rationally clear what his motive is. His motive, in a sense, is not rational, because you can't countenance the evil he does as being rational. It's that he uses reason as an instrument to get what he wants. It's a tool, or what you'd call instrumental reason. Now, one really important theme that actually comes out of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics in dealing with this conflict in the human soul between reason and passions is a theme of self-love. Aristotle says some important things that are very, very pertinent to Othello. And that is that he says the soul should rule the body. It is the thing that causes the body to engage in a certain course of action, live a certain life, and that within the soul, reason should rule the passions, because the passions are blind. They don't see the consequences of their actions. They can't judge the value of the objects they desire, but reason is the thing that is able to use foresight and memory and evidence and make judgments about what the right thing versus the wrong thing is to do. And essentially, when a human being, for Aristotle, when a human being is reasonable and rational, they curb their desires, they act virtuously, they act in a morally righteous way, they act in a just way. And inevitably for Aristotle, therefore, when you act on your passions, or you're a slave to your passions, you necessarily do something harmful to yourself, and you do something that's not consistent with your own good, and you do something that's unjust, right? Aristotle talks about the person who exhibits genuine self-love, who truly has, I think the word we would use is self-esteem. The person who truly has a positive self-image is the person who's lived a life ruled by reason, who does the right things, and they know they have done the right things in their life, and therefore they feel good about themselves. And we're thinking in a kind of very straightforward way here of black and white, of what the right thing is to do versus the wrong thing, without getting into examples of what that might actually constitute. Therefore, Iago makes this very prescient statement. early on. He says, he's talking to Rodrigo, and it is this observation, this psychological observation by Iago, that is the kind of entryway into manipulating every other character. And one of the interesting questions is this observation he makes about human nature and human psychology, is it also true of Iago? Depending on how you think of it, the answer could be yes or no. He says, "O villainous! I have looked upon the world for 4 times 7 years." This man is 28 years old, but he seems much older than that. "And since I could distinguish betwixt a benefit and an injury, I never found a man that knew how to love himself. Ere I would say I would drown myself for love of a guinea hen, I would change my humanity with a baboon." So he says, I never found a man that knew how to love himself. Now, the person who would love themselves would be able to distinguish between a benefit and an injury, or something that's good for you rather than that's bad. And the problem is the passions want what they want blindly, and a lot of the things they want are bad for them. And therefore, when one commits an injustice, one knows better. When one gives in to one's passions and does the wrong thing, most of us know that we've done the wrong thing. And that's, of course, the irony and the strength of the passions, is that it is precisely that we know what is right and wrong, and yet, despite our conscious awareness of what the right thing to do is, we do not do it. And therefore, when we do that wrong thing, knowing that it's not right, we feel guilty. We feel shame. We have a low sense of self-worth, and therefore we do not truly love ourselves. And what's the significance of that? That is the site of insecurity that Iago is then going to leverage and manipulate and exploit, because everyone wants to be seen positively in the eyes of others. What's fascinating is in the Nicomachean Ethics, in Book 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle talks about people who know they haven't done the right things and don't have a high opinion of themselves. They seek out the opinions of others to make themselves feel better, among other things. And so now we can start to see why particularly Othello and maybe Cassio are susceptible to the deceptions of Iago, because he's exploited this frailty. And I think the way we would translate what he's talking about here is a certain type of insecurity. So, the flaws Othello has are the flaws that everybody has. And despite his vices, he exhibits many virtues. And in many ways, he's more virtuous than the other characters in the text. So the classical cardinal virtues are wisdom, moderation, courage, and justice. And clearly, Othello has courage. He's a warrior. That is the virtue of the warrior. He clearly exhibits a sense of justice. In fact, he's more than any other character seems to be particularly concerned with the principle of justice. Is he moderate? Not so sure. Depends on the circumstance. Certain circumstances can bring out. Remember what he says about his jealousies. I'm not normally jealous, but my mind was wrought such that my jealousy was finally provoked. Which is to say, if you provoke someone enough, anybody will be jealous, right? Is he wise? I think the answer is no. And I think part of the answer is his lack of moderation and his lack of sophistication in the terrain, not of the battlefield, but of ordinary society, and the machinations, the different types of wars and the different types of machinations that go on there. So what I'd like to do now is to establish Othello's character and how this character is established in Act 1. And Shakespeare is very determined in Act 1 to present a virtuous man, maybe with a vulnerability in his love life, but in terms of the public figure that he cuts, he is a man of great dignity and respect, and it seems to be the case that his reputation and the respect he has is very deservedly earned. So in this scenes, he is being confronted by Brabantio, the wife, his father-in-law, the husband of his wife, and he has to make a public reckoning of the fact that he has married his daughter behind closed doors, which is obviously, cause for some degree of suspicion. And he convinces them of his decency through the eloquence of his speech, but also, obviously, more importantly, through the substance of his speech. And what does this show us? This shows a man who is highly, highly integrated into the European culture. He knows how to speak their language. He knows, and he holds the same virtues dear that they do. So he's speaking in the Duke's palace, right? Remember, they have convened to commission the military to go into action. It's basically a declaration of war, you might call it. And he is now called to account for his actions and to explain himself. And the Duke, or the Doge, becomes kind of the judge, adjudicating the two sides, and he gives Brabantio a moment to speak, and he gives Othello a moment to speak. So what we have here is a kind of dispassionate assembly or courtroom where either side gets to state their case, with the opportunity to speak rather than to fight with hands. This is the courtroom is a different type of battlefield. And Othello prosecutes his case with great dignity and effect. He says, "Most potent and grave and reverend signors, my very noble and approved good masters." Right? So he's general, and they are politicians and leaders. They are his commanders, just as he is a commander of men on the battlefield. So he's acknowledging his order of rank here, which is a theme that will be really important in Iago's first major speech, when he speaks of masters and servants. "That I have taken away this old man's daughter, 'tis most true, I have married her. The very head and front of my offending hath this extent no more, rude as I am in my speech." Rude as I am in my speech, meaning that he lacks the niceties of sophisticated public speaking. He speaks crudely. He speaks in the vulgar manner. Well, if you read the speech, that's not the case. He speaks he's quite articulate, and he's quite eloquent. And in fact, he wins them over with his eloquence. And we should also say, what is the big accusation lurking? The accusation is not that he's just had this clandestine affair with the daughter. The accusation is that he is a black man who has some type of special seductive power over the white woman. And they accuse him effectively of using some kind of black magic on her to seduce her. And he will go on to explain exactly the magic, quote unquote, he used to seduce her. Very interesting. "And little blessed with the soft phrase of speech, for since these arms are mine, after 7 years' pith, till now some 9 moons wasted, they have used their dearest actions in the tented field." So he acknowledges, I'm a soldier. I'm used to fighting battle with my arms, not speaking in what has effectively become a courtroom. It's a different kind of battle. "And little of this great world can I speak." Little of this great world can I speak. The world is a specific, important concept, ties in with the Globe Theater, but the world is everything that's in the world. It's all facets, good, bad, ugly, in between, gray, black, white, what have you. he only knows, he's a military man. And while he's seen things that other people haven't on the military field, he has a certain blind spot and naivete, and he's acknowledging it right here. In little of this great world can I speak, more that pertains to feats of broil and battle, and therefore little shall I grace my cause in speaking for myself. So broil and battle, fighting might and battle, physical might, and arms meaning literally your arms. Yet by your gracious patience I will around unvarnished tale deliver. I mean, this is beautiful. I will around unvarnished tale deliver. Let's start with a tale. Well, he's going to give an account. He's going to tell a story. He's going to explain himself. He has been put on the spot here. He is, you might say, the defendant in the trial, and he needs to make his case. He needs to tell his side of the story of why he took Desdemona. The tale is going to be varnished. It's going to be nothing but the truth. To varnish is to conceal or to beautify or to edit and polish in a certain way. Make it better than it really is. He's going to tell it just like it really is. The very thing we saw at the end of the play. This is important because this is a world where everyone is duplicitous and hypocritical, right? A round tale. What does round symbolize? It symbolizes wholeness. He's going to tell not just the truth, but the whole truth, right? It says, of my whole course of love, let me start. I will around unvarnished tale deliver of my whole course of love, what drugs and charms, what conjuration and mighty magic. For such proceeding I am charged withal. I won his daughter. So you see the language of the court. He is charged with using drugs and charms and conjuration. And the drugs and the charms, the conjuration, the suggested magic and aphrodisiacs and things of this sort. But these are really to be understood metaphorically as the charms of a Moor who has special magical ways with women that the white European men are not entirely conversant with. And they feel threatened by him. And this is the first instance of the play in which we're not seeing Othello, but we're seeing the Moor, that side of the character. So here we have Act 1, Scene 3, round line 115. He's now going to tell his unvarnished tale after Brabantio has said his piece. He says, I do beseech you, send for the lady to the Sagittarii, and let her speak of me before her father. If you do not find me foul in her report, the trust, the office I do hold of you, not only take away, but let your sentence even fall upon my life. So what does he say? If she gives him a foul report of Othello, not only take my office from me, but take my life. Now, is that entirely appropriate? Perhaps it is. Perhaps it's a kind of excessive display of honor. Perhaps that would be what befell him. Duke says, fetch Desdemona hither. Ancient, conduct them. You best know the place. He's speaking to Iago. And until she come, as truly as to heaven, I do confess the vices of my blood. So justly to your grave ear I'll present how I did thrive in this fair lady's love, and she in mine. So he speaks of the vices of the blood. Now, it turns out that the vices of the blood are in fact not sex, and their courtship was actually not through physical relationship, but through conversation. And of course this throws everybody for a loop, because their characterization, their stereotype of Othello is this kind of bestial, overly sexualized figure. And the Duke says, "Say it, Othello." He says, "Her father loved me, oft invited me, still questioned me the story of my life. From year to year, the battles, sieges, fortunes that I have passed, I ran it through, even from my boyish days to the very moment that he bade me tell it, wherein I spake of my disastrous chances, of moving accidents by flood and field, of hairbreadth scapes, iteth imminent deathly breach." So he acknowledges that Brabantio, the man who is attacking him and accusing him of stealing his daughter, was very good friends with him. And how did they become friends? His father was fascinated with this man, a military man, also a Moor, fascinated when he was just someone to befriend, but very different story the moment that he takes his daughter, right? So you see, this is like, people who believe in, integration and being around a multicultural world, but then they send their kids to a private school and it's all of one race. Things of that sort. And what does he ask him about? He wants to know, what was the battlefield like, right? And Othello is slightly old to be being married, and what we discover is that this marriage is a kind of respite and ease on him psychologically from the trauma of war, which he withstands and he endures, but nonetheless he is aware of suffering it. "Of being taken by the insolent foe and sold into slavery, of my redemption thence, and portents in my travailous history, wherein of entries vast and desert isle, rough quarries, rock and hills which touch heaven, it was my hint to speak, such was my process, and of the cannibals that each other eat, the anthropophagi, and men whose heads do grow beneath their shoulders. This to hear would Desdemona seriously incline, but still the house affairs would draw her thence, whichever as she could with haste dispatch. She'd come again, and with a greedy ear devour my discourse, which I, observing, took one a pliant hour, and found good means to draw from her a prayer of earnest heart, that I would all my pilgrimage dilate, whereof by parcels she had something heard, but not intentively." So what happens? In the process of doing her business, the house business, she's doing the women's work. She overhears the conversation between her father and this warrior, and she becomes intrigued by it. Her ear is greedy. She wants to hear. She wants to hear these stories. And for Brabantio, the stories are about adventure and drama and the ups and downs of war and things that he hasn't experienced directly. But for Desdemona, these stories speak to the trauma that Othello has suffered psychologically on the battlefield, and she feels, maybe pity is a slightly too strong word, but she feels compassion and concern for the trauma he's suffered, and she wants to soothe him, to protect him, and he becomes vulnerable or emotionally open to her, which is the kind of antithesis to the kind of attitude one has to have on the battlefield. "Whereof by parcels she had something heard." So she hears little parcels, little bits of this conversation. She overhears it, but not intentively. "I did consent," so he consents to tell her the stories, "and often did beguile her of her tears, when I did speak of some distressful stroke that my youth suffered. My story being done, she gave me for my pains a world of sighs. She swore in faith 'twas strange, 'twas passing strange, 'tis pitiful 'Tis wonderful, wondrous pitiful. She wished she had not heard it, yet she wished that heaven had made her such a man. She thanked me. Right? So he's talking about the real traumas of war. You know anything about a soldier who's been in the line of duty. This is not something they simply divulge, particularly with people who have not been involved in war. She thanked me and bade me, if I had a friend that loved her, I should but teach him how to tell my story. So he's a good storyteller, not unlike Odysseus, which contradicts his claim that he's a rude speaker. All right, and of course that is a classic rhetorical device that at the beginning of the speech, not only do you explain how you're going to speak to your audience, but you have a sense of kind of false humility and say that, I'm just a humble country doctor, and I don't know how to speak in no fancy way. And then you go on to give, a very eloquent speech. She loved me for the dangers I had passed, and I loved her that she did pity them. This only is the witchcraft I have used. So what's the witchcraft? His powerful stories of his own life. And all of this, of course, illustrates that this is a man who's been through trials and tribulations. He is not nearly as young as hers, twice the age. But he's also an innocent. He's not an innocent on the battlefield, but he's an innocent in the other aspects of life, the kind that you might say civilian life. So this speech is his defense speech, and he is really vindicated here. And Brabantio is still not happy, but he acknowledges that everything has been done in great sincerity and genuine love. And also, I think that to the extent that it's indicated that they have not sexually consummated the relationship, and they do not consummate it until they're actually married. So the only seduction going on here is the seduction of his stories and of his speech, and of, the suffering that she can see behind those words and stories. I'd like to conclude by looking at a couple passages that exemplify and illustrate Iago's plot and the strategy or technique of his plot, which is manifest through this distinction between appearance and reality, and his duplicity of presenting a false image that really is the thing that allows him to really perpetrate the plot. Pardon me? So here we are. We've got this great image that I found online of Iago as a puppet master, and he really is, I like to call him the director of the drama, pulling the strings. And remember, we saw the divine puppet in Plato's Laws. Those strings are not arms. The strings are in the soul, and the strings are the passions, the various passions and desires and motivations that he provokes through his false images, through the shadows he casts on the wall. Iago is a hypocrite. He is duplicitous. And he has a kind of ability that is almost, for lack of a better word, sociopathic. He has the ability to completely conceal any emotion, and we wonder even if it is there. Someone like Othello, the average person, their passionate nature prevents them from showing themselves as other than what they are. It's not easy to conceal your true thoughts and your feelings, and most people, and Iago is an exception, most people feel more at ease when they're simply able to express what's on the inside, and that there is a harmony and conformity between what's on the inside and what's on the outside. With Iago, he seems to be at home precisely when he is presenting a false image to the characters around him. He is described as honest Iago and good friend Iago. And of course, every time we hear these words, we know they're utterly contrary to the truth. And there's a wonderful line from a 16th century French Renaissance moralist philosopher that really captures something important about Iago's deception and hypocrisy. And La Rochefoucauld, he says, hypocrisy is the homage vice pays to virtue. Hypocrisy is the homage vice pays to virtue. Hypocrisy is being duplicitous, presenting yourself one way and being another way, right? It's the homage, the respect that vice pays to virtue. If you're a person doing something diabolical or vicious, you can't just do it publicly. If you're going to succeed in doing it, you have to conceal it. You have to pretend that you are actually, in fact, being virtuous. Otherwise, you're never going to succeed. If you're a liar and everybody knows what you're saying is a lie, you're never going to be believed. So you need the appearance, the veneer, the varnish, the imprimatur of honesty, right? So here is a line that really starts to get at Iago's plot. Particularly, there's one line here that's really kind of crucial. But let me just read it. So Cassio and Iago are speaking, and Cassio says good night. And he says, "Good night, honest Iago," because he has everybody's trust. And once he has their trust, then he can exploit it. Good night, honest Iago. And what's he then that says, "I play the villain"? When this advice is free, and I give an honest, probable to thinking, and indeed the course to win the more again. So they're in a conversation after Cassio has lost his position about how he can get it back and win the Othello's trust. And notice behind Othello's back they call him the Moor. That's interesting. And of course, let's keep in mind that Cassio's fall from grace, his loss of his office, was caused by Iago, and now Iago is presenting the solution to him, particularly diabolical. For 'tis most easy the inclining Desdemona to subdue in any honest suit. She's framed as fruitful as the free elements, and then for her to win the more, weren't to renounce his baptism, all seals and symbols of redeemed sin. His soul is so infettered to her love that she may unmake, do what she list, even as her appetite shall play the god with his weak function. So there's many nefarious things here that he's speaking to Cassio, a man who respects Othello, and he's treating Othello and portraying him in a very negative light. And among other things, he's passionate, renounce his baptism. He's not really a Christian. He's really a Muslim underneath it all, right? And his soul is so enfettered to her love, enfettered to be enchained to her love. What he's saying is, you get to Desdemona and you will succeed with Othello precisely because Othello is so smitten by Desdemona and he will do anything for her. And of course, he makes their love seem rather suspect, and that it's all about emotional intensity rather than genuine love for each other. But this will become something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Even as her appetite shall play the god with his weak function. Now, what is this weak function? I think it's his reasoning. Othello is not unintelligent, but his passions nonetheless get the better of him. So this is an interesting thing about people who can be very intelligent, very clever in certain ways, and still be very weak and vulnerable in others. Her appetite shall play the god, shall dictate, shall determine. What Iago is telling us here is that Desdemona has a power over Othello and his psychology in a way that's exactly parallel to Iago's ability to play God and control every other character. And in fact, in a sense, he's really talking about himself. And he's able to do this because he's a psychologist and because precisely he can identify people's motivations. He knows how to make them tick. This is a natural science. When you understand the cause and you can reproduce the cause, then you can control the effect, right? So that's exactly what he does. And he's inscrutably calculating about this, right? There's no emotion for him. Whenever you see emotion with Iago, he's only using it for effect on the other character. What is her appetite? First of all, it's whatever she wants, and she's presented as capricious. She's presented as a woman who is over-sexualized and is with him because of the sexual appeal, and that really what their whole relationship about is her kind of gargantuan sexual appetite rather than her genuine love for him, right? So that's going to seep into Cassio's mind. How am I, then, a villain, to counsel Cassio to this parallel course, directing to his good, divinity of hell, when devils with their blackest sins they do suggest at first with heavenly shows, as I do now, for whiles this honest fool plies Desdemona to repair his fortune, and she for him pleads strongly to the more, I'll pour this pestilence in his ear, that she repels him for her body's lust, and by how much she strives to do him good, she shall undo her credit with the more. So will I turn her virtue into pitch, and out of her own goodness make the net that shall enmesh them all. Now, we can't comment on everything here, but divinity of hell. I mean, this man is not driven by God, but by the opposite. When devils will the blackest sins put on, they do suggest at first with heavenly shows. When devils, people like Iago, perform their darkest sins, they present themselves with heavenly shows. They present themselves as good friend Iago, right? What he's done here is not just explain that there is a plot. He started to articulate, and now he's speaking to us, right? And he started to articulate exactly how he's going to unfold this plot. And the key line here is, and it's captured in this picture above, I'll pour this pestilence into his ear. Now, in the world of Elizabethan England, how did you kill someone? Well, one way to do it, if you don't want to get caught, is you poison them. And you put it in their ear. So a pestilence can be, in this case it is, a poison. He is going to pour a poison into Othello's ear. The catch is going to be that the poison is not going to be an actual liquid or chemical. It's going to be Iago's words. And Iago is going to sow doubt about Othello's wife in Othello's mind through his words that pass through his ear and into his brain and into his soul and into his heart, and infect him. So now I just want to establish, we've seen a little bit of the discussion of the plot, I just want to establish Iago's character in his deceptive nature. And so this is in Act 1, Scene 1, between the discussion between Rodrigo and Iago, in which Rodrigo is pleading his case to get Desdemona's hand, and he's very frustrated. And Iago, they're both commiserating. They're both talking about the things they're very upset and irritated about. And Iago is lamenting that he was passed over for Cassio. And Cassio, he thinks, got his job not by honest means. And Iago, this is important, thinks that he really deserved the job based on his own merit. And so he has an issue of self-love. He feels insecure because he, has not been recognized by Othello, and therefore he hates Cassio and Othello. One, the man who took the job, and two, the man who didn't give it to him. So he speaks after criticizing Cassio for having this job. He says, now, sir, be judge yourself whether I, in any just term, am affined to love the more. So he's speaking to Rodrigo, but he's also speaking to the audience. Be a judge of whether I, Iago, in any reasonable way, have an affinity to love the more. Should I love the more? Othello. So you see, when he speaks to Othello, he's going to call him Othello. When he's speaking behind his back, he's going to call him the more. Should I have any affinity to love the more in light of what he's done to me? And Rodrigo has this answer that sets up the next speech. The next line says, I would not follow him then. Said, which is to say this, if this is your boss, if your boss does this to you, you have no obligation to follow him. You have no reason to have any affinity to love him. No, what do? You do what you want. You pursue your own self-interest because what you thought was there wasn't. And this is how Iago responds. Iago says this, O sir, content you. I follow him to serve my turn upon him. We cannot all be masters, nor all masters cannot be truly followed. You shall mark many a duteous and knee-cooking knave, that, doing on his own obsequious bondage, wears out his time much like his master's ass, for naught but provender, and when he's old, cashiered. Whip me such honest knaves. Others there are, who, trimmed in forms and visages of duty, keep yet their hearts attending on themselves, and throwing but shows of service on their lords, do well thrive by them, and when they have lined their coats, do themselves some homage. These fellows have some soul, and such a one do I profess myself. For, sir, it is as sure as you are Rodrigo. Were I the more, I would not be Iago. In following him, I follow but myself. Heaven is my judge. Not I for love and duty, but seeming so, for my peculiar end, for when my outward action doth demonstrate the native act and figure of my heart, in complement extern, 'tis not long after, but I will wear my heart upon my sleeve for daws to peck at. I am not what I am. Now let's just start with the last line here. The last sentence. I am not what I am. That sums up the entirety of what he's communicating in this speech. He is something other than what he presents himself as. He's something like a chameleon. And let's just continue with the end of the speech. Right here. It says, when I have completed the act and achieved my end, he says, the native act and figure of my heart, in complement extern, 'tis not long after, but I will wear my heart upon my sleeve. Now, he's duplicitous. He's hypocritical. He conceals his heart. We can't see it. The person who wears their heart on their sleeve is the person who you know what's going on inside of them because they can't conceal it. What he's saying is, once I have achieved my goal and my plot has succeeded, I will reveal myself in my true form to everyone. And he says, for daws to peck at. Daws are birds, right? Like scavenger birds. And I think the scavenger birds, he says, heaven is my judge. It's heaven, God's not the only judge here. The audience is the judge of this character's actions. And the daws who are pecking, they're not pecking on his heart or on his sleeve. Or that's kind of the image here. They're judging Iago, and they're trying to understand what's in his heart, which is to say they're trying to understand what his motives really are. So if we turn back, he says, do I really love this man? And Rodrigo says, I would not follow him. So then the word follow is picked up because Othello's a general and Iago is an ensign. He's in a subordinate, subservient position. And he uses the metaphor, and it's only slightly metaphorical or an analogy between the master and a servant. And Iago is the servant, and obviously Othello is the master as the general. He orders, he orders his subordinates to do things. He is the authority. And he says, I follow him to serve my turn upon him. So there's two things. He follows him. He does not really follow him. He follows him only to serve his turn upon him, which seems to get back at him, to get his revenge. Remember, this is a revenge play. And then he opines about human nature and society. He says, we cannot all be masters, nor all masters cannot be truly followed. So master and servant, unequals, superior, inferior. We can't all be masters. True or not true? True. He's talking about the whole order of rank or hierarchy of society. There are masters and there are servants. That's the way it is. There are superior people and there are inferior people. That's the order of things. And remember what he's upset about. He's upset for not getting the position in society that he wanted. But there's an important distinction between the way we understand a master and a servant. We could be talking about a master or a servant by nature. We're going to be talking about a master or a servant by convention. A master and servant by convention, that person is a master because they've been put there. They don't have the merit, they don't have the ability or facility or aptitude for that position, but it is a conventional status that they've been granted and they benefit from it. So therefore, we can't all be masters because not everybody merits being a master, but all masters cannot be truly followed because a lordship is just a position in society, and not everybody lives up to that standard, and and therefore they don't have that merit. They don't deserve to be respected and followed, except in superficial ways. He's going to show his duplicity here, and he's going to talk about two servants. One, an obsequious subordinate servant who simply does what his master wants him to do, and he effectively wastes his life away for room and board, he says. Then there's another servant who's not really a servant at all. He just pretends to be a servant. And in fact, this servant, not only is he just pretending, he's actually the real master, because he's the one with the real ingenuity. And this is, of course, Iago giving a self-portrait here. And he seems to be making another point, that no servant should waste their time serving another human being and making that the essence of their life. Rather, what life is fundamentally about is self-interest and pursuing your own self-interest at the expense, not the benefit of the other. So here's an important thing. The ancient Greeks and Romans, the central theme of civic life was duty, patriotic duty, which is to say, ultimately, responsibility for others, whether that's your family or whether that's your city-state or Rome or what have you. Iago says the point of life is not duty to others. The point is to satisfy yourself. Look out for numero uno, right? So here's the first servant. And this guy is a fool, because if the principle of life, look, society tells us we should have all these duties, but who ever really satisfies them? We all know that that's just, we pay lip service to that stuff. In reality, everybody's looking out for numero uno. That's the dirty, ugly, Machiavellian truth of it all. So if you're not looking out for number one and you're not serving your self-interest, you are a fool. And of course, Othello is going to be the fool here, and he's going to be the servant, and Iago is going to be the master and the clever man. He says, you shall mark, you shall see many a duteous and knee-crooking knave, which is to say, to be duteous is to be dutiful, to follow your duties. Knee-crooking, you're either kneeling down and being subservient, or maybe your knees are crooked because you're constantly doing work for the master and you're bending down. And a knave is a kind of a fool, a servant, someone of low status, that doting on his own obsequious bondage. So to dote like you dote on a loved one is to do things for them in a kind of kind-hearted way. Obsequious is to be, it's like beyond humble. It's to be subservient in a kind of almost pathetic way. So he's obsequious to his own bondage. He's really obsequious to his master, but being obsequious to your master is actually just, it's like showing veneration for the fact that you're a slave. Like, what self-respecting person would find that dignified? He wears out his time much like his master's ass, and by that we mean the donkey, not the master's rear end, although there may be a pun on that. But he wears out his time. His life is passing him by, serving someone else. For naught but see, you're all agreeing with Iago right now, aren't you? I can tell. For naught but provender, and when he's old, he's cashiered. So he does all this, he wastes his life for nothing more than food, and at the end he's cashiered, he's put out to pasture. He says, whip me such honest knaves. So, be off with you. Get out of here. I couldn't care less. I couldn't care less about you. Others there are, and the others there are is he's talking about himself now. Another type of servant. A servant who's duplicitous, a servant who deceives and hypocritical, who is hypocritical. Others there are who, trimmed in forms and visages of duty, so the language of appearance and reality here, right? To be trimmed like a tree, right? Decorated. They decorate or ornament their behavior in forms, trimmed in forms and visages. Visages and appearance is literally the face. It's the thing you see. So, pretending to be dutiful, showing the appearance of being dutiful, yet all along keep yet their hearts attending on themselves, while they pretend to be attending to their master. In fact, in reality, they're always concerning themselves with themselves. And the very moment that it appears they're doing something from someone else, in actuality they're doing it for themselves. This is exactly what Iago does. In every gesture that looks like a kind-hearted act of charity, he's in fact advancing his own self-interest. They do well thrive by them, and when they have lined their coats, so line their coats means they've sewn in riches in their coats. That's where it comes from, to protect jewelry and things like that. People and silverware, people would actually put their valuables in a coat so that it couldn't be stolen. So basically it's like he's the help who's going around picking up the nice objects that the master has overlooked. They do themselves rather than their master homage. These fellows, they have some soul. And this is a very perverse, they have some humanity, because they've actually made something of themselves rather than giving up their life for someone else. And yet, by the same token, this type of person is totally duplicitous, corrupt, dishonest, misrepresented what their life is to everyone else. And he says they have some soul, right? So this is a very ambiguous word, what this means. And such a one do I profess myself. This is my self-portrait. This other type of servant. This is really just me. For, sir, it is as sure as you are Rodrigo. Were I the Moor, I would not be Rodrigo. I would not be Iago. So this is just a kind of like 2 + 2 = 4, and 2 + 2 does not equal 5 kind of thing here. In following him, I follow but myself. Heaven is my judge, not I for love and duty, but seeming so. So it's all a show. He seems that way. Heaven is his judge, right? Well, there's an interesting question here. Does this character really believe in God? If he doesn't really believe in God, this is just rhetoric, and it's heaven's not going to be judging him. And maybe that's exactly the logic that permits him to act this way, because he does not really believe there is anyone in heaven judging him. For when my outward action doth demonstrate the native act and figure of my heart, so when his actions, external, demonstrate his true motivations, he talks about the native act, which is the act, native being connected with your birth, what you actually are, your kind of natural identity. When his natural identity is finally revealed after all this duplicity in complement extern, so there's a complement between inside and outside, and finally the external actions are going to complement or be consistent with the internal motivations. And then, as we said, 'tis not long after that he wears his heart upon his sleeve. His motivations and his inner being will be revealed to all for us to judge. So we're going to stop here, and in the next lecture, we're going to look at a little more about this issue of appearance and reality, and we're going to look at how it plays out in the 2 speeches that you were assigned for your second reading response.